Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for New York Comic Con in its Metaverse online virtual incarnation in 2020. I'm Maryelizabeth Yturralde of Creating Conversations in Southern California, and I'm going to be fangirling out with a wonderful group of creators today. This is the Fandom for the Win, All the Geeky Goodness panel. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then we're going to discuss fandom and people who've contributed to it and the ways that we interpret it personally and have participated in it, and just basically have our own little teeny tiny convention virtually together, because that's really the best way to experience fandom often. So our first panelist is Olivia Dade. Olivia grew up an undeniable nerd, prone to ignoring the world around her as she read any book she could find. Her favorites, though, were always romances. As an adult, she earned an MA in American history and worked in a variety of jobs that required the donning of actual pants. Colonial Williamsburg interpreter, high school teacher, academic tutor, and, of course, librarian. Now, however, she has finally achieved her lifelong goal of wearing pajamas all day as a hermit-like writer and enthusiastic hag. She currently lives outside of Stockholm with her patient Swedish husband, their whip-smart daughter, and the family's ever-burgeoning collection of books. And spoiler alert, publishes on October 6th, 2020. And because we're recording this in September, I'm not sure if that makes it just released, about to release, released in the past, but it should be available via bookshop or a bookstore near you. And now, Pat Dorian. Pat is a cartoonist whose illustrations have been featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Mad Magazine, and other national publications. His animation work includes projects for Cartoon Network, Comedy Central, and PBS. He teaches at the Pratt Institute and School of Visual Arts in New York. Lon Chaney Speaks publishes on October 6th as well. Welcome, Pat. Ooh, visual aids, yay! All right, Sarah Kuhn. Sarah is the author of the popular Heroine complex novels, a series starring Asian American superheroes. First book, the Locust bestseller, a Romantic Times Reviewer's Choice Award nominee, and one of Barnes & Noble's science fiction fantasy blog's best books of 2016. Her young adult debut, the Japan-set romantic comedy I Love You So Mochi, was a Junior Library Guild selection and a nominee for YALSA's Best Fiction for Young Adults. She's also penned a variety of short fiction and comics, including the critically acclaimed graphic novel Shadow of the Batgirl and the Star Wars audiobook original Dr. Aphra. A third-generation Japanese-American, she lives in Los Angeles with her husband, an overflowing closet of vintage treasures, and Baby Yoda mug. And all of Sarah's books that were mentioned are available now. Baby Yoda, hello. And Sam Maggs. Sam is a best-selling writer of books, comics, and video games. She's been a senior game writer, including work on Marvel's Spider-Man, author of books like The Fangirl's Guide to the Galaxy and The Fangirl's Guide to the Universe, The Unstoppable Wasp, Built on Hope, and Tell No Tales, and a comics writer for beloved titles like Marvel Action Captain Marvel, Transformers, which gives her something in common with some of our other panelists, and My Little Pony. Her work has taken her to comic book conventions all over the world. A Canadian in Los Angeles, she misses coffee crisp and bagged milk. Okay. Conquest, her debut middle grade novel, is out now, and The Fangirl's Guide to the Universe will be published at the end of October. Welcome, Sam. And Abraham Riesman. Abraham is a Providence-based journalist, writing primarily for New York Magazine about arts and culture. His work has also appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, the New Republic, and Vice, among other publications. True believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee is definitely in the future, regardless of when this airs, because it doesn't publish until February 2021. Welcome, Abraham. and Tom Sciloi. Tom is a contemporary comics artist who gained prominence as co-creator of Godland, a Kirby-esque space opera which was nominated for an Eisner Award for Image Comics. He wrote and drew American Barbarian for Ad House Books and later IDW. He drew and co-scripted with IDW editor-in-chief John Barber, Transformers versus G.I. Joe, and recently he wrote and drew Superpowers, a series of short comics appearing in DC's experimental imprint Young Animal and Fantastic Four Grand Design. He completed a modern reimagining of Godot bots for IDW, and he is known for his unconventional style, dense page layouts, and imaginative writing. He's one of a small number of mainstream comics creators today who writes, draws, colors, and hand letters his work. Jack Kirby, The Epic Life of the King of Comics, is out now. And because IDW has come up a couple of times, I have to confess, and some of you will, I can see Sarah laughing. I know she's anticipating what this is going to be. When New York Comic Con asked us for our best known works, I was really tempted to make mine David Marriott, editor at IDW, because he is my son. But that was a little uber geeky. And he, by the way, says hi to like most of you because he knows many of you. So the first thing I'd like to do is to have each of you talk a little bit about your work and about how it deals with fandom, with fame, and we're sort of going to go back in time because we're going to start with Pat, and we're going to start with Lon Chaney Speaks, which for those of you who know Lon Chaney but maybe don't remember, movies used to be silent, including in his original era. So Lon Chaney Speaks was sort of a big thing when it happened, and he was the first of our historical figures. So Pat, why Lon Chaney Speaks, and why did you choose to let him speak, as it were, in your storytelling?
So Lon Chaney was kind of known as the man of 1,000 faces. So he had sort of the unique ability through makeup to transform himself into anyone. So through makeup, and he was also amazingly good at pantomime, mostly because both of his parents were deaf. So that was incredibly valuable in silent films when everything was gesture, pantomime, and he had, as people call it, sort of a deaf face. So one of the reasons why I chose Lon Chaney, or was interested in Lon Chaney, was because he was kind of a pioneer in film because of this. So during this time when he's coming up with all these crazy makeup effects, such as roles that he did for, let's say, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, The Phantom of the Opera. He did several roles, collaborations with Todd Browning, The Unknown, London After Midnight. There were no makeup artists. It didn't exist as a profession. So through trial and error and through experimenting, he sort of protected his technique of transforming himself with makeup. So that's why I other than the fact that he's also a genius, and he was also kind of a champion for outsiders as well, which continued that sort of idea of that theme of being an outsider continued, and also other universal films, such as The Wolfman, which his son later played, Lon Chaney Jr.
And to a certain extent, he's a little bit of an outlier in this discussion because he was probably not particularly interested in fandom. I mean, it didn't exist as we knew it, but.
No, he would have hated this. He would have, Comic-Con, he would have run away from like a plague. So one of his supposedly famous quotes is, between films, between pictures, there is no Lon Chaney. So he didn't want he didn't want the public to know anything about his private life. There's a famous newsreel where they're going into a studio and they're going down the line of actors and showing actors waving to the camera, saying, "Hey, this is our actor, blah, blah, blah." And they go to him, and then they finally get to Lon Chaney. And before the camera can see his face, he turns around so no one can actually see what his face looks like without makeup. He kind of wanted to build this sense of mystery, man of mystery. One could be a clever marketing strategy, whereas basically the public wants to know more about him because he's so mysterious. And also it could have been possibly self-preservation to hide certain details about his past, which I talk about in my book.
Excellent. Thank you. Tom, we're going to transition to you, and your focus person is Jack Kirby, which makes sort of a nice intermediary between, your Pat's work and Abraham's work. So Jack Kirby thought about being a street thug, but ended up being an amazing comics creator. Talk a little bit about your appreciation of him, why you chose him as a subject, and also, as Pat did, you chose to use his own words to tell the story.
Yeah, Jack Kirby was a huge Lon Chaney fan also, and references his work lots of times and does his little spin on a lot of those classic silent movies like Hunchback of Notre Dame. But yeah, Jack is like one of the founding fathers of just comics, like comic books. He was there at the very beginning, and created characters like Captain America and the Vision with Joe Simon, and then in the 40s he created the romance comic genre again with Joe Simon, and created comics in every imaginable genre. And then in the 60s with Stan Lee, like he created like the Marvel comics as we know them, Fantastic Four, X-Men, Avengers, and then if that wasn't enough, in the 70s he created a whole other pantheon of characters for DC, the New Gods characters, Mr. Miracle, the Forever People, and then a bunch of other things like the Demon and OMAC. So and then he just continued to create comics until the 80s, when he went into TV animation and created a bunch of shows, Turbo Teen, Thunder the Barbarian, the Mr. T cartoon, if anybody remembers that, and had this like immense career.
The fool doesn't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, good point. So I mean, he was just phenomenally influential on other creators, and then just like his body of work is immense. That whole like Marvel Comics cinematic universe that we've been experiencing for like the past 20 years, most of those characters are created or co-created by him. It's a very small number that he wasn't involved in. So it's kind of like hard to overstate his importance. And then as far as fandom goes, he was there at like the very beginning of comic conventions. Like he was involved with very early comics fandom with Shel Dorf and the founding of like the San Diego Comic-Con. And he's just throughout his life was like always open to fans. Like people could just like out of the blue knock on his door and show up, and he'd let them in and feed them and talk to them. This kind of stuff that's sort of unthinkable now. But yeah, he was always, he had like a great appreciation for the fans and relationship. And he himself was a fan. He wasn't like a comic book fan. He was a fan of science fiction pulp magazines. Like he collected them obsessively from the time he was a kid, and still, followed them, over the years. So yeah, he was a fan.
Thank you. And this makes a really nice segue into Abraham and Stanley Lieber, who was born just a few short years after Jack Kirby, and who has arguably created an amazing amount of the world of fandom as we know it now. Has helped elevate some of the geekier products, but perhaps whose own best creation was Stan Lee.
Sure. Well, I mean, you can argue a lot about what Stan brought to the table in the Stan Lee Jack Kirby partnership that Tom was talking about. But one thing that's hard to argue with is the fact that of the two, Stan was the salesman. And when it comes to sales, that's something you can only really generate in comics if you're able to stoke a core fan base. And that's something that Stan did very well. There are a lot of things Stan wasn't great at, but Stan was very good at getting people who were somewhat interested, people who weren't interested at all to become interested, and the people who were interested to become diehards. There was this real talent that he had that is, we can get into all kinds of biographical detail, but my personal theory is that his time in the military was a huge influence on his approach to fandom, because he was essentially a military propagandist. His whole job in the military, in the so-called playwrights division, was to create internal propaganda. Now, sometimes it's harmless propaganda, just teaching you how to, function within the military. But the fact is, he was always trying to get reactions out of people and get people to pay attention. Anyway, fandom plays a big part in the book because those skills that he developed there and then brought forth during the Marvel Revolution not only changed the way fandom worked, but also just on a more personal level were kind of what kept him afloat. I mean, around the end of his life, he didn't want to be doing conventions anymore, but that was his main source of liquid income. And that was something that became very important in those days. I don't want to get too dark, so I'll step back here for a moment. But Stan and fandom are pretty heavily intertwined. You can't really talk about one without talking about the other.
All right. And Sam, so I feel like we're doing sort of a timeline of fandom segue here, in that there's properties out there that fangirls found and fell in love with, whether or not we were invited. The, marketing, propaganda, whatever you want to call it, may not really have been directed at us, especially, if we weren't not only not dudes, but not white dudes, not white cis dudes, etc. So talk about being someone who both has found her own joy in embracing things you're fan of and creating in, and also the ways in which you look at helping expand that base.
Yeah, I think the way you put that is super interesting, because women have obviously, or I think a lot of people know that women have always been really heavily involved in fandom. Fandom, I guess modern fandom as we know it, really started in the 60s with Star Trek fanzines, which were all created by women, mostly to write like MM/fiction, which is where the term / comes from anyway. So women have always been really involved in the fandom processes, but I think that oftentimes we didn't feel super welcome in the places in which fandom was being discussed, whether that be at a comic book store or a video game store or an online forum, where we didn't feel we could be honest about who we were. And I think a lot of that changed with the advent of social media. I think we're in a real great time to be a fan, because we were able to find our own communities online, form our own communities full of people like us who shared similar interests, but also were, women or queer or people of color, or sort of marginalized in some way outside of what people maybe expected. And I think that was pretty cool. It also allowed us to speak directly to the people who are making the things that we love, to say like, hello, we're here. We would like things for us as well. And that's kind of been my experience. I grew up a big nerd. My parents were both big nerds as well. They went to see Star Wars: A New Hope like 22 times in theaters in the 70s. And my dad read Silver Age comics growing up. And I was a big sci-fi fan growing up, but didn't really feel like I could share that story with anyone, because I felt like I would be ostracized or made fun of, or it wasn't cool, or I didn't know any other girls who were into this, because they probably also didn't want to admit it. So it was very hard to like find my people. It wasn't until I graduated from college and I realized that there are like 6 billion people in the world, and surely some of them will like me for who I actually am, that I started to be like more open about it. And, largely through Twitter and Tumblr, was able to kind of find and create that community for myself. And it was around that time when I was 25, when I wrote the Fangirl's Guide to the Galaxy, which was a handbook for girl geeks, basically about getting girls into comic books, video games, nerd culture, or if you were a girl into it, kind of letting you know that you weren't alone. It was a book that I wish that I had had when I was 15, because I felt like it would have made me feel seen. So I felt really lucky to be able to do that. And now the Fangirl's Guide to the Universe is coming out at the end of October. It's a second edition, so fully updated for 2020, which was great because I got to cut a lot of references to like dudes that have been revealed to be not so great dudes out of it since then. So that's 2015 was a different time. And also the Fangirls Journal for Leveling Up is coming out at the end of October, which is a, self-guided journal about your own fandoms and experiences with fandoms, where hopefully, if you've had a similar experience to what I've had, you can kind of work through that in the pages of the journal.
Thank you. All right, so let's level up to Sarah. And Sarah, I saw you nodding a lot. I know that a lot of these things kind of resonate with you, including, finding ways to get yourself seen on the page, whether it's creating your own characters or getting to create characters in a universe that used to be full of just white stormtroopers. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yes, I feel like Sam and I have done like a 1,000 panels together, and I feel like we have very similar experiences with fandom and coming into fandom and kind of figuring that out for ourselves and finding our people on the internet and all of that. But yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that I wrote Heroine Complex, which is my Asian American superhero series, was just because I had grown up enjoying all these things. I had always loved superhero stories. I had always loved comic books. I had always loved Star Wars and Star Trek and sort of these fantastical adventures that took me out of my very small, very white town. And I never saw myself in them. I never saw Asian American women really centered in the, or, women of color period or people of color period centered in these narratives at all. So one of my goals with that series was to write something fun like that, where it was about, these girls having adventures, having a lot of fun, eating bad junk food, singing bad karaoke, saving the world, having amazing romances. And they just happen to be people who look like me and who look like my friends. And there was something about that, when I was writing it was very powerful to me. And one of the things I tried to kind of address in that series as far as fandom and what shapes us is kind of what is considered canon and who gets to make that distinction, like who decides what is canon. Because I felt like in a lot of ways, the things that I was attracted to for certain reasons or that I love for certain reasons were always considered not important. And I do remember when the first Heroine Complex book came out, there were some reviews from men, pretty much all men, or just white people in general, that said things like, this is a lot of fun, but it's not earth-shattering. It's not important. And my response to that was always like, if I had had this book when I was 12, it would have absolutely shattered my earth. Like it would have been earth-shattering for me. So I think that's an interesting concept to sort of interrogate when we're talking about fandom. What is considered canon? What is considered important? Who gets to be the main character? Who gets to be important? And in the newest book, Haunted Heroine, there's a whole thing, where the two heroines of the story are going undercover at this college. And there is a class where the very white, very male professor is sort of lecturing this group of girls about like, here is what's important literature. Here is what, is in the canon. And they sort of push back against that of like, well, just because something means something to you doesn't mean it means something to me. And just because something means something to me, but it might not mean something to you, it does not mean it's not important, and it does not mean it deserves to be in the canon. And what I'm basically saying is that, me and Sam and people who are writing these narratives where we're finally putting ourselves at the center are in the canon and absolutely deserve to be there.
All right, and then we're going to take it one level more because, Olivia, in spoiler alert, you deal with all these issues, but you also create your own fictional intellectual property and its own fanfic. So
I'm a lifelong shipper, and I moved to Sweden a couple years ago. And around that time, I found myself almost completely unable to read published books anymore because it had become so wrapped up in sort of my author identity that it was hard for me to detach my brain and just fall into a story. But I could still do that for fan fiction because I think, because it wasn't published work, there wasn't marketing behind it. So I read nothing but Jaime Lannister and Brienne of Tarth fan fiction for about a year. And last year, of course, last season of Game of Thrones came out. And as you may have heard, it was not universally beloved. And around that time, of course, there were interviews with cast members, some of which they appeared to be shooting impromptu hostage videos. And it was, in some cases, interpreted, rightly or not, to indicate a certain amount of discomfort on the cast part with the stories and the way the stories had ended. So sort of the premise of spoiler alert is that if you were a cast member on a show like that and absolutely loathed how the story had gone and the sort of messages that the show was sending by the way that it ended, but you didn't have a good way to publicly express that, could you express that by anonymously writing fan fiction about your own show and writing fix-it fix, essentially, to fix the things that you thought that your show got wrong, including sexism, a certain cynicism about, I think that often grim, dark, unhappy endings, death, despair, stagnation are often valued much more highly than any sort of joy, and are seen as somehow more realistic always than happiness or love or joy, even though life is not all grimdark. It's a lot recently, but it's not entirely. And so we have a character on the show who's writing fan fiction critical of his own show, who has a BFF in the fandom, who's his beta reader, and whom he's pining for, but can't really say anything about it because it can't come out that he's being so critical of his show. But then what if he met her in real life, and she's a take-no-crap geologist who's fat because, again, fandom issues, fatness, race, homophobia, there's all sorts of issues, obviously, within fandom, even though people have found deeply meaningful communities within fandom, there's still problems. So if he met her in person and ended up being attracted to her and having chemistry, but couldn't really say that he already had known her for years, where would that go? So that's what Spoiler Alert is about. It's about fandom and fan fiction and fatness and family, and I think a celebration of communities and a celebration of inclusive communities.
I love the idea of joy and inclusivity. So let's end on a lightning round where hopefully each of you has this because it was the assigned homework. Name one property that you were a fan of when you were young that is holding up as an adult. And let's go back in the same order, starting with Pat.
The Wolfmen, Lon Chaney.
Tom?
I mean, for me, it's not a groundbreaker, but Star Wars. Star Wars was everything to me as a kid, and I've grown with it, and to this day, I'm as excited about the new stuff as I was about the stuff I liked as a kid. So Star Wars.
Abraham.
For now, Dune. I don't know if the movie will ruin the fandom, but it's happened before to other fandoms, but Dune has held up pretty well.
Sam?
Stargate. Still a huge Stargate fan, and the fandom is 99% middle-aged women, which slaps. And everybody's really nice. It's great.
Sarah?
Babysitter's Club, which I think also showed that it can be updated and withstand the test of time.
And Olivia?
Again, lifelong shipper, so X-Files. David Duchovny gave me feelings that I had not had before. That show.
And on that happy note, I think there's a whole section of the Fangirls Guide devoted to that. Thank you all so much. Thank you all for being prepared, for being passionate, and above all, thank you for being fans and taking part in this panel. And we will see you soon. Take care.
See you.